A late session income tax bill clears the Senate in a squeeze, but can the House be persuaded? A corporate tax reduction with a revenue neutralizer. Has the time come for an internet sales tax? Animal waste versus water quality, a political and environmental conflict at the Capitol. But first, what medical educators hope will be a first major step in keeping doctors in Arkansas and putting them where they're most needed. Arkansas Week, next.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Arkansas Week. We'll get to our roundtable and the General Assembly in just a moment. First, some good news, and good news it is. The University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences is up on the cusp, on the edge of graduating a record number of students. And what better time than to check in with the Dean of the medical school, Dr. Christopher Westfall. Dean, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
The numbers seem pretty impressive, 160 grads, but as impressive to you as we understand it is the placement of these graduates in residencies, the next step in their clinical education, medical education.
We had the very best residency match event that we've had in 30 years this year, which was wonderful recognition for those students that are graduating. If you don't mind for a minute, I'd like to talk a little bit about
why is that important?
Let me talk a little bit about how you get to that point in the career. When I started out in medicine, I did not understand this, and so I suspect that other folks had the same feeling. The pathway from graduating high school to where you become that doctor that sees you in their doctor's office begins with 4 years of college, then 4 years of medical school, then the match occurs, which is what we're going to talk about, for a year of internship, and then between 3 and 7 years of residency. And then the doctor is ready to see you in his office or her office. So it's a long process, and the match occurs during the 4th year of medical school. So the medical students apply for their specialty, the one that they're interested in, whether that's pediatrics or surgery or internal medicine or psychiatry, and the location that they want to do that residency in. And then on match day, which was last Friday, they all open their envelopes at the same event to find out where they're going and what they're going to be specializing in.
Sort of like Oscar night.
Exactly like Oscar night. In fact, the line is, the envelope, please.
Well, yeah, and there were more smiles than usual this year, I gather.
Yes, this year, we had 100% match rate for every student that wanted to go into a specialty, a residency, achieved one. And that's unusual.
Which tells us what, Doctor?
Which tells us that they've gotten a great education, that they're well prepared, and they're well accepted in the community and ready to go to that next step, which is to do the on-site training, elbow to elbow with another practice clinician, and learn how to become a specialist.
Well, one of the primary concerns in recent years, for a long time, frankly, has been to keep medical students in, or divert them somewhat, not divert them necessarily, but to recruit them into the primary general medicine, general practice, pediatrics, OB/GYN, where there seems to be a shortage, particularly in rural areas.
You know, you're exactly right. In the state of Arkansas, we've been designated by the federal government as a primary care limited state, and over 75% of our counties are uncovered in primary care. So it's very important to us as a state to have doctors who are primary care physicians, and those are defined as people that are in internal medicine, family practice, OB/GYN. And that's an extremely important field for Kansans to have doctors graduating in. This year we had over 50% of our physicians matched into residency programs that are primary care residencies. So that's great for the state.
Well, and of course now we have 2 osteopathic medical schools up and running, one in Jonesboro, one in Fort Smith, which will produce some. It's one thing to train, though, and another to retain, is it not? How?
Yes.
After they've seen.
That's a great question. The way, when we look at residency programs, we find that where doctors accomplish their residencies is where they tend to practice. And so where the individual goes to do this training, which was identified last week on match day, leads us to determine where exactly they will probably end up. For example, the University of Arkansas has about 800 residency positions across the state, not only here in Little Rock, but also in our 8 regional programs across the state. And we find that of those individuals, particularly those that train in the regional programs, 60% of the physicians stay in that area, in those rural locations. Since 1978, the rural practice programs, the regional programs, have graduated about 1,300 physicians, and of those 1,300 graduates, 800 of them have stayed in rural Arkansas.
What has changed? What has made the difference in that curve?
So I think that
the higher retention rate in underserved areas.
I think that the answer is because we've had a focus on it. There are a number of programs within the state of Arkansas which are designed to ensure that we have physicians introduced into the rural setting and then that they stay there. We find that doctors, once they begin to practice, that they like it and they stay in the rural location.
Put down roots and...
Exactly.
Well, there's some other good news, Penn, that we trust, and that's the prospect of some additional, after this general session of the General Assembly, an additional, or should I say elevated, I'll let you define it, focus on cancer research.
You know, this has been a fantastic General Assembly for cancer research because the university is making a significant effort to develop NCI designation, National Cancer Institute designation, which is very important to Arkansans because about 44 Arkansans are diagnosed with cancer every day. About 6,000 die each year from cancer.
44 diagnoses a day.
A day. Mm-hmm. Very high. And we have a wonderful cancer institute, the Rockefeller Cancer Institute, and we are trying to achieve Cancer Institute designation by NCI, which gives us the opportunity to access clinical trials and therapies which are not otherwise available to us. And so this will, if we achieve this NCI designation, it will allow Arkansans to access to the very latest and best care. Right now, some of those trials, some of those therapies, they have to leave the state for, and we want them to be able to get that here at the Winthrop Rockefeller Cancer Institute. Under the leadership of Senator Missy Irvin and under the leadership of Representative Michelle Gray and, of course, the governor, the General Assembly voted unanimously, both in the Senate and the House, to fund the NCI pursuit of the university. And so we're very hopeful that that will put us at the right step into getting this very important designation.
We're certainly willing to overlook the irony, I guess, in the funding source of some of it.
Yes.
The tobacco.
Yes. Yes. And the irony is that although if you look at it, you're referring to the fact that there is some of the funding will be coming from tobacco tax,
Sure.
But if you think about it, it makes sense.
Perfectly logical.
It's perfectly logical because lung cancer is one of the most common cancers, and we all know that tobacco use leads to not only lung cancer but other cancers, and so it's appropriate that that tax should go to help out with the health care and the treatment for cancer.
Doctor, thanks very much for your insights.
Great.
Thank
you very much.
Please come back.
Thank you.
All right. And we'll be back with the roundtable in just a moment. And now the legislative session, or more on it. Sarah Kellogg joins us from KUAR, for which she covers the Capitol. Benji Hardy, reporter for the Arkansas Nonprofit News Network. And lady and sir, thanks for coming in. Sarah,
of course.
More tax legislation. Maybe 3 weeks left in the session, but more tax legislation.
Yeah, Hendren introduced this bill last week about it, and it's low and middle income tax cuts, and it was pretty much introduced with a lot of fanfare from both sides of the aisle. And what it does, there's 3 parts. It lowers the tax rates for low and middle income Arkansans, it increases the standard deduction, and it also allows a minimum of 5% on the federal earned income tax. And so to pay for that, it would be an increase on taxes on cigarettes, and would also allow e-cigarettes to be taxed.
Where did this come from? I mean, boom, all of a sudden it was there.
Well, I mean, if you're listening to Hendren, it's been in the works with the Democrats and Republicans for a little while. They wanted something that, for him, that addresses all Arkansans, more Arkansans, and so it passed in the Senate. Kind of not as overwhelmingly as you would have expected, considering the announcement, but so now it heads to the House, and I think it's really, you have to look at House Republicans, because according to Representative Clowney, all the Democrats are behind it. So I think it's up to House Republicans to see if it gets actually through.
Yeah, I mean, it took 2 votes in the Senate to pass, and even then only by the narrowest of margins with 18 votes.
A squeeze.
Some pretty vocal opposition, too, from some senators, all Republicans. And yes, considering that it's the President Pro Tem that introduced it, and considering the fanfare with which it was rolled out, the fact that it barely squeaked by in the Senate, I think, is kind of ominous for its chances in the House. There's, I think 40 House co-sponsors signed on to it, so that's pretty close to the 50-vote threshold, but whether or not, I don't know. I mean, whether it gets bottled up in committee is a big question. I think that it's really, I mean, its chances are dicey in the House.
Yeah, and a tobacco industry source told me about the middle of the week, hey, wait a minute, haven't we paid enough so far this session?
And plus no comment on the governor about the bill either, so that could be...
Right, which is interesting, and you know, the fact that, again, the main sponsor is the governor's nephew, Senator Hendren. The fact that I mean, the governor certainly hasn't opposed it, but that he's been fairly lukewarm, I would say, on his comments about the bill so far.
All right, and still in the hopper is the corporate income tax reduction bill, which would have an offset that has been electric in the past several sessions.
Yeah, you know, I mean,
how to pay for the cuts? Yeah.
Imposing a sales tax on internet purchases across the board. You know, in 2017 there was some movement in that direction, and ended up certain vendors like Amazon got a tax placed on them, but this would be a much broader taxing of internet vendors, paired with a corporate tax cut that really, though, I mean, to say it is offset is a bit of an exaggeration, because over the very long term, the revenue reductions that are contained within the various corporate tax cuts would end up exceeding probably anything that's coming in new from the internet.
I mean, absolutely. Just looking at my notes, and 9.8 million, to be reducing revenue in 2021, 29.5 million in 2022. So that's a lot of money that the taxes on the internet sales, they won't make up for it potentially.
Yeah, and then also there's just, I mean, as always, you have to think about the sort of regressive nature of sales taxes, and I think there's widespread agreement that it's only fair to tax internet purchases the same way that we would tax local purchases, but in the long run this does reduce taxes on corporations, and it does increase the amount of state revenue that's being paid for with sales taxes, which are the most regressive kinds of taxes.
Even assuming a continued healthy growth in general revenues and a national economy that keeps perking, Fed has said no more rate increases this year. Wall Street responded. Still, it's a tight as a tick budget, general revenue budget. There's not a lot of room for error, it would appear.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and I mean, you look at the whole package of tax cuts, from the personal income tax cut that was passed earlier in the session to this corporate tax cut, and it just all adds up to a picture of slowly sort of whittling down general revenue over the long term, I would say.
Okay, there's an environmental conflict as well, and that involves well, the broader issue, I guess, is water quality and how farm waste and fertilizers and stuff would be regulated. But it's interesting that there's one facility in particular, and that's that controversial one near the Buffalo River, that everyone is kind of focused on. Benji?
Right. So there's a bill from Senator Gary Stubblefield that would transfer regulatory authority over certain types of liquid animal waste from ADEQ, which has traditionally been the sort of clearinghouse environmental regulator in the state, to
Department of Environmental Quality.
Right, Department of Environmental Quality, and it would transfer that to the Natural Resources Commission. So, at first glance, it's sort of deep in the weeds. Like, what does it matter which agency has regulatory authority? But environmental quality has, a staff full of scientists. This is kind of what they do. And the Natural Resources Commission is much less sort of equipped to do the deep dive into the science behind some of these things. So the Farm Bureau is behind this bill. It's widely seen as something that would be a concession to agriculture, to big agriculture.
Yeah, and Stubblefield basically says the point of this bill is just to make it easier for farms to go through this regulatory phase, because with ADEQ and the Arkansas Natural Resources, or that's the Arkansas Natural Resources Commission, which would now take over, that's two separate entities, so having it just be under one roof would be simplifying. But there are all sorts of concerns on whether or not that would lower the threshold for environmental protection. And even, that was the news yesterday that the EPA is looking into this bill to see just the impact it might have on such permitting authorities and the environment.
It was an easy win in the Senate, but enter Mr. Hutchinson, who declares himself opposed.
Yeah.
Or if I'm reading it correctly, I think it's fair to say he's opposed.
Yeah, he's made it clear he has some concerns about
deep, profound reservations.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the interesting questions of this session is how much the governor's word, just by saying he is opposed, how much muscle does that have? I think it's clear that if the governor, invests a lot of energy and time into lobbying members against a bill, then that can have a major impact. But as we saw with this Confederate flag bill that recently,
there's our segue. Okay.
Yeah. Right. So Representative Charles Blake once again tried with the bill to redesignate a flag or a star in the state flag from symbolizing the Confederacy to honoring Native American tribes and. This is just all about symbolism and what do we do with the sort of weight of Confederate history of the state. The governor previously was neutral on it, and then he came out saying, "Yes, I support this." And I think the assumption was that would sway some Republican members, but it really didn't in committee.
Yeah. So.
I think maybe the biggest change was there were maybe people non-voting as opposed to voting no. That was kind of maybe the biggest switch. But this was the second bill that he's proposed. So the initial bill would have changed the star above the state's name to represent Native tribes as opposed to the Confederacy. And this new bill would have changed it to represent the United States, was one of the stars on the bottom representing Native tribes. And there was basically the opposition to that bill came from kind of two camps, and it was people who didn't like the stripping of the Confederacy on the flag, and there was people who just didn't like honoring Native tribes, which was something that I wasn't expecting when I was hearing this bill, but that was also another of the angles. And it didn't, ultimately it didn't get the votes to pass despite the governor's support. But one of the interesting arguments was from Representative House, which was he didn't like that the flag represented anything. And he thinks that everyone was wrong and that it should be no symbolism at all and just represent what
Doug
we
House
wanted
of
to.
North Little Rock.
Yeah, and he's proposing his own bill that would do exactly that, just strip the flag. So that the bill isn't, it failed, but it's not necessarily gone. It might come up in this version of the bill, and Blake said he might bring it up on the Senate as well.
Go ahead.
It's last session in 2017, the governor threw his weight behind a bill to separate Robert E. Lee's birthday from Martin Luther King Day, which has long been this sort of black eye for the state, and it passed. And I think that you can look at that and assume this was all the governor's sort of handiwork. By blessing that decision, he facilitated that separation in a way that in previous sessions that there had been attempts, it just wasn't possible. But, again, this goes to the question of how much work does the governor have to put into these things? Because he waved his hand this time and nothing so apparently happened. Yeah.
These hot-button social things, I suppose with the exception of abortion, which he assigned, I think, everyone that came to his desk, governors, and many of them have sort of accrued on Mr. Hutchinson's watch, but LGBT matters, songs to the old Confederacy, paeans to the old Confederacy. They make him exceptionally nervous. He wants to keep them out of the headlines. Not good for business.
True.
And you know, we're perfectly willing to give him credit for doing whatever he thinks is the right thing to do.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you mentioned the LGBT issues. I hadn't thought about this really, but you know, now I think back to 2015 and the sort of volcanic controversy over the
bathrooms, or what I can't remember.
And there was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act bill by Bob Ballinger that you know, sort of mirrored this thing in Indiana about, you know, legalizing discrimination, some said. And I mean, it was clear he was very, very uncomfortable with that. I think you're right. He's tried to keep a lid on those sorts of things as much as possible.
And a late one from Mr. Hutchins, and that involves vouchers targeted at Pulaski County.
Yeah, and we're getting to the point of session.
Public school vouchers.
Yeah, public school vouchers. It would allow students in Pulaski County, probably around 500 of them, attend private schools through scholarships.
Howls immediately.
Yeah, very unhappy with some of the Democrats and just education people just representing public schools. And so what it does is it establishes these scholarships, but it is a pilot program. So it would be a 5-year limit. And according to Ken Bragg, who's the House sponsor, he thinks that the fact that it's a pilot program and there is a sunset for it, that it's not permanent, that he thinks will increase his chances for it passing. But I mean, the big question now is we're winding down on session. So it's, you know, you're passing these, you're trying to propose these really big bills and big strokes, but you know, you only have so much time left. So are they going to even get it through to make it to the governor's desk?
And of course, some applause on the other side too, as well. I mean, you know,
well, you know, the thing about this bill, I mean, it's explicitly targeted towards low-income students. I mean, families have to qualify for free or reduced federal lunch money in order to be eligible for the scholarship. So the argument from the school choice folks is that this is not. I mean, this is giving kids from poorer families a better shot by letting them go to private school. I just want to point out one argument from the other side, which is that, you know, within that range of free and reduced lunch, you have such tremendous variation. You know, you have everything from like fairly low-income families, but that are still sort of at the lower range of the middle class, to people who are homeless, you know, and think about which of those families are going to be more likely to apply for one of these vouchers and get their kids into a private school. There's still sort of an effect of, well, this will tend to leave kids behind in the public school system who are not as advantaged as others.
Yeah, and it's just the question of, you know, helping some of the kids in the Pulaski School District versus all of them, and that was one of the, just for the Democrats saying we should be helping all of the kids in the district, not just, you know, 500 or so.
Right.
And some hands-on reporting that you've been hands-on all week, but one of the most troubled aspects of state government, I mean, it's needs attention constantly. Youth services. State reversed itself on a contract. Yeah,
so this issue just seems to keep coming back and back, like with such controversy. The state has had control over these several youth lockup facilities for kids that are adjudicated delinquent for the past couple of years. The governor has made it clear he wants to re-privatize those, send them back out to private contractors. And after this lengthy RFP process, the state decided on Right of Passage, which is this out-of-state company that already operates one of these facilities. The state said, we're going to give the rest of the facilities to Right of Passage. Well, the only other bidder for that contract filed a protest, and the state investigated, and in a fairly straightforward declaration, the Office of State Procurement said, nope, the protest is correct. Right of Passage was not eligible because they've had a contract canceled in another state due to non-performance. And so just yesterday, the state reversed itself and said, we are handing this contract over to the rival company, Youth Opportunity Investments, instead.
But there's a prospect of an appeal now by the company.
Yeah, I mean, there's not an administrative remedy there, but it's always possible they could sue. And Right of Passage issued a statement that said we're looking into all available, all possibilities about what our next move is here. So.
All right. We're hearing somewhere in the neighborhood of April 1st. That's kind of the target date.
Mm-hmm. For end of session, yeah.
Which would be tantamount, I guess.
Who knows? Yeah, we're definitely winding down the last few weeks, and it's just that's pretty much any of the major bills that we're talking about. It's just whether or not we can get them through the finish line up to the governor's office. And one of the bills that I'm keeping an eye on, and I know you are too, is the bill on habitability, which is setting standards for residential properties for tenants to have suitable living. And so this bill, which was didn't pass on Monday, but they're going to re-vote on it again Wednesday because they think they do have the votes for it. But it's not the same bill that was introduced. It heavily scales back the protection I think it would have given.
Yeah.
Right. Major concessions to landlords and realtors, and that's causing a lot of advocates of the bill to withdraw their support now.
You got to wrap it up because we're out of time. Thanks for coming into the roundtable. As always, thanks to you for watching. See you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.